Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. I have a very special guest, and we've come today at a different time than usual because uh, we uh, because David is in the UK, and the timing there just isn't very good for having a guest on at my usual time because that's like 2 o'clock in the morning for a guest in the UK. So today we've decided to have a special day and a special time to accommodate a UK guest. So welcome, David.
Hello. Hello, everyone in live chat. Type 1 if you've never heard of me. There's usually a few.
Okay. And I also want to say thank you to everyone who's in the chat. We have a very good group here. We've got Taram, Robert X, Brainbug, Maya, Asexual Atheist, Babylon Project. And that is everyone that I currently can see. If I've missed anyone, please let me know, and I'll say hello to you as well. Robert X has just put out the link to your channel, David, and the link to your channel is also in the description of the video. And Taram says, "Hi, David. It's fun being stuck in the UK, isn't it?" Me too.
Yeah, I haven't checked the red zone and green list and whatever. I just can't be asked. I'll stay here for another few years, wait for things to blow over.
Before I get into here's a couple of ones. We got Maya put up a 1 and Babylon Project put up a 1. So Maya and Babylon.
I know who they are.
Yeah, especially since we were talking about Maya before we even started the show. And Maya, there's a reason why we were talking about you before the show, and that is, and I shared just a tad of that in the chat when I said I was really glad that you were here because we're going to be discussing David's new book, which has not come out yet. And some of the parts of the book are a bit controversial. And in writing questions for today's show, I specifically tried to skirt around any racial issues in the book because I really don't feel qualified to comment on those. Some of them get into some areas that I really know very little about, but they are areas that Maya knows a great deal about. So Maya, if we do stray into those areas, I'm going to be watching for your comments and pulling them up and pulling up your questions because that's an area that I just don't feel competent in commenting about. So let's start with just introducing the book itself. David, tell us a little bit about the upcoming book, when it's expected to come out, and what it's all about.
Yeah, sure. So it touches upon a variety of different fallacies and biases. So for those who don't know, I wrote the first book, which I'm pretending like I don't have to hand. Of course I have it to hand. Fantastic Fallacies and Where to Find Them. It's the yellow book. Next one's going to be red. It's called Fantastic Fallacies and Brilliant Biases. And basically over the next month or so, I'm trying to get as much feedback as I can on the initial draft. As I said in our pre-show notes to Kelly, the point at which I got to this point last time, I changed like 4 fallacies from scratch. Like it was just awful. I'd messed up.
Okay.
So okay. This might happen again, and that's fine. I've got nothing wrong with saying I'm wrong. I need to correct it because I want to be right, and I want as many true things to be in the book. It's by my name, and it's at the end of the day, it's also charging a fee from people. So I feel compelled to not just give opinions, but in terms of giving value and truth and trying to uphold certain, shall we say, modernist values, which we're going to get into, I'm sure, with some of the questions. So the next month will be a lot of feedback from people. Before I forget, get in touch. It's not all about racial. It's like I touch upon some stuff. So please do get in touch so I can verify that I am on the straight and narrow. And so after that period, I'll basically finalize the manuscript. And once that's done, I can go into the audiobook. It's one of the things people don't realize with writing books, and if you do write your own book, do an audiobook and record it yourself, because if you read it out loud to yourself and it sounds stupid, you need to change something. And when I first did the audiobook for the first book, I'd recorded it. There were various things, like there was I think there was a motorbike in the background for like just a moment, and it got rejected, and I had to start from scratch. And it was actually Steve Woodford, straight after our podcast together, who convinced me actually it's worth it. Like we've got to, like, as long as you do it and it's right and it's there forever. And he was right, and it's had, I checked the other day, 60, 70 audiobook downloads, and that's more than I thought I was going to get book sales, let alone the audiobook. So if it reads well on the audio, it reads well on the manuscript. And so I'm getting into the sort of headspace of trying to release it in time for Christmas, start of December, that sort of thing. If it's a little bit earlier, then that's fine. The way Amazon work it is that I can submit the written version, and they'll look over it, but they won't like pass any judgment and say this is too much in this direction or that direction. They've come under fire for taking money from a Nazi sympathizer book recently.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's how much checking they do. They're more free speech than that. So this book won't go into that sort of direction, but it's basically on interrogating ourselves. So the first book it was always intended to be an introduction, whereby we look at other people and we go, they're wrong, like over there, theists kind of thing. We can stay together as our little atheist bubble and say, ha, look how stupid they are. But this book is more controversial simply because I'm asking those same readers to now look at themselves and question their own biases towards themselves or their own in-group. And the most important thing is as I say in the prologue, it's not that we're all perfect, and I'm not standing on top of the like moral high ground and saying, look how perfect and amazing I am. I want to highlight some issues, and if the byproduct of that is being told, actually I'm the one that's wrong, okay, that's fine. I there are certain ideas that I've got in my head that are wrong, but I think are right. We all have this. We all have this this idea that what we believe is right, what everyone else believes is wrong. And actually, the intellectually honest thing to do is to engage in conversations like this, where we can be questioned on our ideas or the wording of certain things, and we can then improve. That's the only way to improve, in my opinion, because self-correction can only go so far. And so the book is really trying desperately to encourage people to question themselves in a healthy way, in it, so that it doesn't become too detrimental. Because when you, and I'm waffling here, so please interrupt, but there's one thing that I particularly learned from this process of writing these books all the time, is that I notice a fallacy where nobody else does, and I self-correct myself mid-sentence, and nobody knows why. So I just look like I'm hesitating, and I'm like,
and that's what I can't do.
Yeah.
And that's why I appreciate books like this, and this is why I have been trying desperately for about 6 months to try to get the attention of Stephen Wooford, to try to get him on for this exact kind of conversation, and because they go right over my head, and someone has to point them out to me because I miss them. And I think reading a book like this would be helpful because if I understand the fallacies better, I might be better at recognizing them.
I definitely throw out I can't remember the exact number, but people can find my YouTube channel. It will say David Worley is the name of the channel, and then it'll be like these orange thumbnails which say DRP on it, and one of them is like 136 or something like that, is my talk with Steve. And the first 21 minutes is just me and him going back and forth over the fallacies of Stefan Molyneux. It was about 4 days after their debate, and Stefan was everywhere. he just couldn't not put a fallacy together. This just it was one after the other, and sometimes I would be pointing out upper faces to Stephen. He was like, "What's that? I don't even know what that is." And it was just bouncing off each other, just so naturally. That's that first 20 minutes. Forget the rest of the conversation, but that first 20 minutes was just wonderful. I really value Steve. He's difficult to get in touch with. I've been trying to get in touch with him over because he produced the card game Debunked, and next year
I have a copy of that.
It's lucky for some. It's I didn't manage to get it. It's only available in the US, I think. Still, he's still got that on his website anyway. Yeah, that's the official line.
I got it a long time ago.
I tried to get in touch just because I'm making a card game, and that's different, and I'll discuss that on another day because that's like
I would really like to see
safe for work.
I'd like to see Steve make an expansion pack for the card game, because the one thing I was disappointed about with the card game is I thought it would be a way to learn fallacies that I didn't know, and yet the ones that are included in the game are very common ones that I was very familiar with, and I was like, oh, rats, I wanted some things that were really going to challenge me, and so I'd like to see an expansion pack with some of the lesser known ones.
Yeah, the second book is essentially my expansion pack, and I got some very interesting comments from the first book, because it's not to bang on too much. We'll go into some of the details of those questions in a minute, but it feels like that it's definitely helping people, because I get messages all the time from various different people, even just completely random reviews on Amazon, and I have to express just not just for me, just any self-published author, the reviews that come in on Amazon are they're like gold dust. And if you do have a copy of somebody's self-published book, whether it be me or it could be Erin Lewis, or just anyone that's published their own book on Amazon, and you have that copy of the book, just throw 5 stars down. It really helps an independent creator.
Okay. Taram asks a really good question, a question that I had on my mind as well. It says, is fully understanding the ins and outs of all the fallacies actually required? Is it not enough to be able to spot them and know that there is a fallacy there? I'm not clever and my brain fails. And I would agree with Taram 100% there. Not that Taram's brain fails, but that I frequently can spot a fallacy, but I don't know the name of the fallacy. And correct me if I'm wrong, David, but I think that the advantage of being able to name the fallacies is because it gives you a better framework for determining how to handle it.
Yeah. So when we have these conversations, there's a particular manner and a tone in which we engage, and that's more beneficial to the conversation if our aim is to try and convince the other person that they are wrong. And when we engage in these conversations, we end up thinking that as soon as we can recognize it, and there's this like palpable relief sometimes when I've gone through it myself and I've gone, that's the name of it, and I can now call it out, and it's that, and that's so powerful. Like the feedback that I was getting, some people were saying like, I now recognize what that is. I put a name to it. It's very liberating, and so on the flip side, I have to say, in terms of engaging in conversations that are useful and practical with other people, especially theists, it's not always best to just point them out and say, you're wrong, this is a fallacy, but it's good to understand what it is, and then just explain an example. Like if you understand another example, you can point out the example and say, would this be right? This logic doesn't work. Should we apply this logic over here as well? We don't need to necessarily call them fallacies or anything like that, because when you point out a fallacy, you're essentially saying you're wrong, and that puts up a wall, and you have more conflict between each other. So definitely not. You don't have to understand the ins and outs. I don't claim to. There's so many nuances and everything that goes on. So this book was only ever meant to be, both of them actually, brief tasters, especially the first book. The second book will go into more detail and be more challenging, because you're questioning yourself, not just other people. But it still doesn't go into a huge amount of detail. It's like 1 page per fallacy, 200, 250 words each. It's just what it is, an example. But sometimes these examples are now not just from the first book where I said, Christians do this. I'm now saying, atheists do this. And then people are like, controversy. And it's like, no, it's fine. It's forgivable. We probably haven't been questioned on these things. And I'm very happy in reverse to be, have people point out my flaws. And that's okay, because I want to know my bad ideas. I want to improve,
One point I kind of missed that I kind of want to get back to is you mentioned that you were trying to get the book out by December, and I think that's a really good goal. I don't know if you were aware of this going on in the US, and I don't know if the same thing is going on in the UK, but we are starting to see an issue with a lack of goods. There are ships that are lined up in the ports off of both coasts of the United States that can't land, and they can't distribute goods because there are insufficient dock workers, there's insufficient truckers, and the store shelves are starting to empty. And they're saying that if you want something for Christmas, get it now, because you probably aren't going to be able to. And being able to get an audio book is something that you don't need delivered physically. And so, that's a great idea. Do you have the same issue there in the UK?
Yeah, we're currently putting it down to Brexit. It's very popular, but I mean, yeah, it's typically certain produce on shelves and fuel. That's the main issue that's been going on. As soon as I've moved from the farm, I've sort of started living as a hermit for the past 3 months, so I'm fine because I'm not moving around. But I understand it's vital for the things I deliver, and I'm dependent on what deliveries can go to the supermarket, and I'm all of that. So yeah, I wouldn't know the exact reason. I think it's down to a lack of truckers and drivers. I don't know how that's going to be squared with the potential advent for driverless sort of Tesla lorries and that sort of thing. I think we're not quite there yet. But push comes to shove, I'm sure if we could, as Elon says, we could get a space crew to Mars in 2024 or whatever he's trying to do, which I don't think is going to happen, but I think we can probably build a few lorries, but it's a lot of infrastructure and a lot of bureaucracy that goes through governments, and it would be more straightforward to get through the House of Commons than it would be through the House of Representatives, I'm sure.
Taryn wants to know who's going to be doing the voice for the audiobook. I assume it's you.
It is me. Yeah, I received one small piece of feedback that it was a good idea for me to do it, because then I can say it in the way I want it to be heard. And as we were saying just before we came on air, it's especially with a book like this, which can be very easily misinterpreted. I can, even with the audiobook, I just throw in extra words, and nobody's sitting there. I don't think they're sitting there just reading every word along with it. Maybe they do, but it's like they do for kids, But I try and I at least try to do it justice. Like, I'm not trying to be this exuberant. Like, hi, this is an audit, and I'm trying to just really speak very clearly. I won't go too much into it because I'll start waffling. But it's me. Yeah, it's me.
Okay. I have David graced me with an advance copy of what he has, and so I have read it over, and I've picked some parts to that I've written some questions on, and let's start with some of the questions that I've written. In the prologue, you say beginners to this level of thinking need only worry about learning fallacies and biases. It takes an intermediate level epistemologist to notice these flaws in our own arguments. And this refers back to a previous paragraph where you explain biases we all bring into conversations. What struck me here was the word epistemologist. And maybe I'm showing too much ignorance here, but I had only heard this word used by apologists and had used it in context with an analysis of the epistles. Please explain not only what the word means, but also how we can start to see and what to look for and to notice these flaws.
Sure thing. So also a brief sort of mention as well to something that we agree on beforehand, which is that just for absolute transparency for the audience, I sent the manuscript. It's not finished. It depends on this month's worth of feedback. And then Kelly had a few questions, very good questions, because I was saying to her, it's like smelling your own farts. Until you give it to somebody else, you don't know whether it's any good. So there was some very good and interesting feedback, and we have tried to avoid having this sort of conversation before we actually had the interview. But yeah, we wanted to avoid it being so scripted, and so this is still me thinking mostly off the top of my head, but I do also have notes, which I'm trying to get up on iPad, but I can't, so it's on my phone. So yeah, the first part of the first book explains epistemology. Now, I didn't realize this other meaning of like the epistles and things like that. So that's interesting. It's always good to find out these new things. As I said, I don't know everything, but epistemology is basically the study of what we know and how we know. So, in brief, if you could imagine I've forgotten the name of the Acropolis. Is that in Greece? So you've got like the roof, and then you've got all these pillars that are holding it up. So the roof is your ideas, what you believe, and the pillars are your reasons why you believe what you believe. If those reasons are bad and they are found to be bad, we've referred to them as fallacies. And those bad reasons, if they all go at once, the idea falls down, the roof falls. Hopefully that sort of imagery helps people. So when it comes to epistemology, I was I want to make absolutely clear as well, there's reasons, but it doesn't necessarily negate the conclusion. So when we say when I talk to a theist, for example, I don't just dismiss their conclusion, and this is why I'm actually quite happy with myself because the last fallacy in the first book feeds into the sort of second book. And I didn't plan that because they're about 18 months apart. But the last fallacy is called the fallacy, where we see a fallacy, and then we automatically get rid of the conclusion. Say, there was a fallacy used, you're wrong. And that's not the case always. What we've got to do is say your conclusion might be right, but it won't ever be right with these bad reasons. Replace these bad reasons with good reasons. And that's my position. So again, trying to get this point across to theists, and atheists can see it very clearly. It's like, yeah, I can see flaws over there, but you're now doing it to yourself, and it requires a degree of intellectual honesty, which is why it's more challenging, more controversial. So, for example, I wrote one note as well, which said there was something on Twitter trending earlier. There was white privilege. It was trending earlier on Twitter in the UK, and it was to do with I think it was a Conservative MP, Member of Parliament, over here, who was trying to claim that teachers who use the term white privilege should be reported to Prevent, which is a organization that's trying to prevent extremism. So if you have if you suspect a girl is potentially at risk of FGM, female genital mutilation, you can, as a teacher, anonymously report and say, there might be an issue here, and that sort of thing is what it's meant to be for. This guy obviously came under a lot of scrutiny, and I didn't fully read into it, but there was one response that said, "This is the way the Nazis treated teachers," and this is an obvious fallacy in that you could say that anything about the Nazis ate food, therefore eating's wrong. So it's not that I'm negating the conclusion, it's just the reasons that led up to it didn't add up, if that makes sense. So that's what I mean by epistemology. And street epistemology is something that was pioneered by Peter Boghossian, who sort of recently left his job at Portland University for various reasons that we might get into for if we get onto the grievance studies and that sort of thing. And his book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, basically set the guidelines and the sort of the groundwork for people like Anthony Magnabosco to come in and do street epistemology, which is going out there and having 5-minute conversations with strangers and just relentless questioning people's ideas, like, how did you come to this conclusion? What do you make of this example? Does that strengthen your belief? Does that weaken your belief? What evidence do you need to change your mind? All these different things. And Objectively Dan, who does Truth Wanted for the ACA, was famously, the videos are still on YouTube for a few years ago, he was deconverted by Anthony Magnabosco for this exact process. It's fascinating because you can see him as a Christian, and now you can see him doing like a lot of atheist work every week. So yeah, sorry, that was a very long answer.
Okay. Second question I have, in the book you say, in all probability, everyone held ideas 10 years ago that we are now embarrassed to admit. Thus, it would be logical to conclude that we will look back in 10 years' time and feel the same way about what we currently believe. The problem is trying to find out which of the ideas we hold now are good ideas and which ones are going to embarrass us in the future. My question is, we see this time and again with people who are nixed from political office or from celebrity positions because of something that they said in the distant past. How can anyone foresee what is coming in the future so as to avoid public statements that could be potentially embarrassing?
So, in short, we don't. It's impossible to see the future. If you're claiming to, it's an appeal to the future, and it's saying something along the lines of, the future generations will judge you for this idea, except we don't know what the future generations will be like, because they might live on a completely different planet that's underwater, for all we know. So they might not even care about the words that you use or whatever. They'll worry about how many crops are being grown or something. And so I would put the emphasis on the other foot. Instead of saying, how do we avoid people's scrutiny, we should question why they're scrutinizing in the first place. Can we see history from the perspective of, there were certain morals at the time, they're never going to know future morals. If we assume the idea that over time we improve, then naturally we are going to be inferior to people 2,000 years time. If people 2,000 years ago easily believed in what is like a pre-modernist sort of magical thinking, and they believed like in devils and ghouls and witchcraft and things like that, then we're going to be viewed in exactly the same way if we continue the same rate of progress that we currently are now, kind of thing. That's at least my logic. Maybe I'm appealing to the future, but it's I think we should be favourable towards people. Ultimately, I'm personally against looking at people for their worst parts, especially looking back on people like early US presidents who had slaves and things. I don't think if they were around now and they still had the same views, yeah, all right, let's judge them. But it's a lot like that meme where the fish, like the older fish, swims past the younger fish, like, how's the water today, boys? And the younger ones are like, what's water? So they're just immersed in water. They don't know what it is yet. And when we're in the present, we're immersed in our society. We don't necessarily get hindsight, and that's something that I mentioned in the book. Hindsight is just inevitable. People look back and they have more information on history. Why we look back? Why didn't people in Germany just see Hitler coming? Like, it's so obvious, and it's not. It wasn't at the time, and it was seen as a better option, and it's obviously wrong. But I don't think we should judge Germans at the time necessarily for being scared into accepting certain things. Maybe some people were bigots, yeah, sure. There's obviously a lot of that, and they'll probably advance quite high up the hierarchy. But I wouldn't be too judgmental on people in the past. I don't want to be judged myself. I'm trying to be the best I can,
Okay, very good. You say to engage in shunning is to shut down the conversation with people who would have challenged our perspective. Once shunned, neither side gets their view discussed, and bad ideas are permitted to fester. I personally see this frequently with family issues. When an issue becomes heated, it's good to step away and to have a cool down period. But too often, the cool down period ends up being forever, and now the subject becomes a taboo subject. How does one avoid this, and how do you get back into a discussion without reviving the emotional issues that are tied to the discussion?
Yeah, I've heard a few people say how the pandemic and death in general has put things into perspective. Like their beef isn't so substantial anymore. It's amazing what puts our eyes into focus, and we start to view each other favorably. I think the first step is something that's really difficult, and it's going to be a sentence that sounds very odd initially, and the book's full of these sorts of odd sentences, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think our enemies are profoundly similar to us, and I don't think they are over the hill over there somewhere, and they're just so different. We've got this much in common, this much that we disagree on, and it's not the case. Maybe we disagree more with those people than we do with we disagree on less than I would disagree with the Nazi on more, kind of thing. I keep mentioning Nazis, I don't know why. It's just an easy go-to, isn't it? It's Godwin's law.
They tend to be the extreme example.
Yeah, for good reason, really. So where was I going with that?
We were talking about
shunning. Sorry to interrupt. You can finish your point if you want.
No, I was just going to say, I was just going to get you back, your thought back on track, and I was mentioning
that's okay.
That, yeah, that's what we were on.
That's all right. So, shunning. So, I mentioned this in the first book about how to set some groundwork for having some conversations, and of course, not everyone is capable of having those conversations. You can't necessarily get through to a Kent Hovind like you can some randomer on Twitter. Those are very satisfying conversations to have as well.
Sometimes
you can finally see the cogs going. Yeah, well, some people are, and we'll explain different stages of how integral people's ideas are to their beliefs and their identity. But I outline Rappaport's rules. This was reformulated by Daniel Dennett, and Daniel being one of the Four Horsemen. So though he's one of the lesser known ones, because Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris get the limelight. But Daniel points out there's 3 rules that you have before you can effectively criticize. You're allowed to criticize at any point, but if your aim is to be effective, then you have to do one of 3 things. You have to do all 3 things. 1, you have to state the other person's position accurately, preferably better. Hey, Christy, I haven't spoken to you in ages. Stop being so distant on Twitter. She gets back to me every 3 weeks. Anyway, so first rule, represent the other person accurately, preferably better than they can. If you can articulate something better than they can, there's a degree of rapport that is built there. Secondly, state where you agree, and don't just state anything that is like a very common things that you agree on. State things where other people might disagree, but we agree. Like there's a difference between us and them, and you're saying we agree on this controversial point or whatever it might be, but everyone else disagrees, and that builds that connection. Because once you have that connection, you can say something as intellectually honest as the third point, which is, I actually don't know, and I know my limitations. I don't know certain things, and that's okay. I'll try and work out at a later date all these different things that you mentioned. You mentioned the epistles. I'm like, oh, so I don't know, and that's good. That's healthy. That says you know something that I don't know, and that puts them in a position above you just for a moment. It can be very if you're talking to the wrong person, that could be seen as like defeat for you and victory for them. Depends on how honest they are. But if you stick by those things, state the other person accurately, state where you agree, state things that you don't know or what your limitations are, your criticism then comes in from a good place. It's not just a wall of bad stuff where we agree on nothing and we disagree on 10 things and that makes you a bad person. Instead, we can have these healthier conversations where we can say, actually, we agree on loads, but we disagree on a little bit. And that's more receptive. We're all more receptive towards criticism like that because it comes from a good place. It's not coming from a malicious place. That makes sense. So that could probably help.
Yeah, I had an experience about like that recently where I was discussing the abortion issue with a theist, and we had a couple areas of common ground, but then he made a statement that I could not agree with. And I just said, agree to disagree on that particular point. And when I did, I was surprised at how gracious he was. And that was actually where we ended up leaving the conversation, but it was a good conversation. And Christy had a point that I wanted to put. Yeah, here we go. This is what I was thinking of as you were speaking. Steelman that claim. Yep. As you were saying, restate the other person's argument, and so I was thinking, yeah, steelmanning them. Yeah.
So very briefly, if I may, sorry to interrupt. The steel man is the opposite of the straw man. The straw man is misrepresenting somebody, and the steel man is saying, I'm going to try and strengthen your argument.
I was basically about to say the same thing, that if you're steel manning, that avoids the straw man fallacy.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on a bit. You say there are three main types of thinking that have dominated in the last millennia: pre-modernism, modernism, and postmodernism. I'm going to let you briefly explain each of these and how those relate to the rest of the discussion. But first, I want to relate an interesting anecdote from my college days. Now, you have to realize that this was in 1982, so we were still in the modern era. We had not reached the postmodern era yet. And it was funny because the professor knew that it was called the modern era, and he said, speaking in the modern era, but that term can also have a different connotation. And when he started thinking about that, I said, how is it possible for anyone to speak in any other era besides the modern era? and I'm thinking, if he could see today what he had said then, he'd say, well, yeah, now it's the postmodern era. So anyway, go ahead and explain how those three ways of thinking are different.
Yeah, they all have positives and negatives, I guess. So first of all, modernism would typically denote anything in the West from 400 years ago to now, really, in which we started to value the scientific method, critical thinking, rational thinking, books, that sort of thing, and that led to which was the Enlightenment. It led to assumptions of innocence before being proven guilty, and as such you would need to prove with evidence and valuing evidence. That didn't happen before. Pre-modernism is religion, faith-based thinking, magical thinking, superstition, supernatural, a lot of feudalism, which is like monarchies and that sort of thing. And there's a very clear hierarchy between people, and at the bottom of the peasants, and it is easily Googleable. And then what we see is ideas of coming in from postmodernism, which are, in my opinion, some good, some bad. And so postmodernism is something like valuing the group and egalitarianism. Its tendencies towards the political spectrum, which is like more socialist, communist ideas, if you could consider modernism more like capitalism. And so modernism would value the individual and our autonomy so things like liberty come into it. Whatever the French slogan is, liberty, equality, all of that. It's all these different words are sort of mashed into modern and postmodern. So postmodern, you end up valuing the group more than the individual in some cases, and we try and find out in practical terms that means socialist healthcare, or education for all, equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity. Or sometimes they're both pretty good. I would personally, having stood for the Green Party politically, I would say yes to certain ideas that are considered postmodernist and good for the group, like everyone receives public health care, so that sort of thing. Free education, children at least. I would extend that to university, but the university is sort of like in trouble at the minute, and I'll explain that in a moment. But hopefully that gives at least a brief overview of what's going on right now. So the sort of groups that we're talking about socially, the pre-modernists are more like the religious, the modernists are the scientists, more like the atheists that brought in sort of secular values and that sort of thing. And then the postmodernist is still very new. I would say something like the 60s onwards. If you say 80s, it doesn't really matter. It's all roughly very, very new. And so these ideas about our identity and our group identity, it comes into a lot of issues to do with social justice, and it's got to the point where there are some things that I would personally criticize, but again, it's done in the same vein as the same structure as I just mentioned. I'm going after the reasons. The conclusion may or may not still stand. I just need better reasoning behind it to get on board. Does that make sense?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hopefully.
Okay. In the book, you said that Mikenana, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, recorded events from the grievance studies hoax, where people wrote fake scientific papers and managed to get them published. One of the papers went so far as to get an award. The hoaxes included parts of Hitler's Mein Kampf, rewritten from the perspective of feminism, and a paper that described fat bodybuilding as a serious sport. The aim of the hoax was to highlight the fact that social science scholars were accepting opinions as science so long as the paper agreed with their politics. Scholars started to create environments where people had to agree with them rather than being encouraged to think critically about a range of different topics. Post-colonial theory, fat studies, queer theory, gender studies, and most notably critical race theory. Now, when I read this sounds to me like a conspiracy theory. It sounds like you're saying that we can't trust anyone because the experts are all limiting the information that we can get, and to what agrees with them. Isn't this a bit paranoid? And do you think there's a widespread censorship in the scientific community?
First of all, for people who have no idea what the grievance study stuff are, videos are out there on Mike's channel. He's an Australian documentary maker, and so if you've ever heard of these people, like when I mention Peter Boghossian, for example, who's like, scare quotes, the grandfather of street epistemology, as I'd mentioned before, from his book A Manual for Creating Atheists. And then he came out with another book, which is How to Have Impossible Conversations, which is a big influence on the first book. And that explained things like golden bridges and how we have to try and encourage people to go from one idea to the other without encouraging it, without adding any stigma and things like that. So when it came to the grievance studies, somebody like Peter, he, until very recently, the past few weeks, was a lecturer at Portland University. And he sat down with its other academics at the time. And so people like Heather Haying, Brett Weinstein, you may have heard some of these names. And they sat down and they saw what was being done in certain instances on campus. So they would be just teaching, they'd be lecturing, and certain things and certain events started to happen in their lectures and they didn't know why. So Peter was somebody who will, for example, take really controversial opinions. They will take flat earthers and put them in a lecture theatre and get the students to ask them, fire questions away, like as a way of encouraging critical thinking and the more sort of modernist ideas. And then students started to oppose this, as they only wanted certain speakers to that agreed with them to come along, and he wasn't sure why. And he got together with a few other academics and said, like, where is this culture coming from, this cancel culture? Why are we seeing this on Twitter, where people are being so completely unforgivable for one tweet that they need to lose their job and their life ruined? Why is it that people want sort of me to lose my job as a lecturer? Like, where do those ideas come from? And so they eventually found certain teachings within the humanities that are even going on right now. And it's really difficult to try and come across. If it comes across as conspiracy, then the onus was on me to try and prove my point. I think those documentary videos explain certain scenarios that have gone on better than I ever could. I mean, maybe I'm only skimming over it in the book, and I should do it more justice, but I wanted to keep the book at least compact. And so what we find is there's a tendency on campuses now, where we've all heard of these instances where certain speakers that are considered controversial are being deplatformed. So Alex O'Connor was live streaming at Oxford University when Steve Bannon went to speak at Oxford. Again, it's all very normally in the universities to have this melting pot of ideas of everyone coming together. Doesn't matter whether you're conservative, liberal, doesn't matter. All these ideas get shared and everyone gets tested, and it's like a pack of wolves. Everyone's at each other's throats, intellectually speaking. But what they found was certain academics, not all, it's not indicative of the whole group because that would be the fallacy of composition, but certain humanities professors were publishing ideas if they personally agreed with their politics. And that's not science, that's not modernism. That's now veering into postmodernism, where they're starting to value people's feelings over empirical, verifiable evidence. And so when it comes to certain applications of this, where it would be considered applied postmodernism, so you would come across that term, or maybe another one, which is critical social justice, which is the word I'm trying to, or the phrase I'm trying to use in the book. I'm making a distinct difference there between any old social justice. I'm in favor of social justice. I stood for the Greens, for goodness sake. Like, I'm on board. You know, I'm not going to just go around the corner and just say, hey, let's lynch a few people. Like, honestly, some people overreact to certain things that I've said in the book, or certain things I might have said on Twitter, and I think I can understand where they come from. And I'm not articulating myself, and I put that on myself. But there are certain ideas that I accuse the atheist community of perpetuating, and it comes from these scholars. Now, these scholars, these humanities academics, just to try and wrap up, because this is a very, very complicated thing that I'm trying to sort of compact down here. They would accept certain papers that if it agreed with their opinion. So what Peter did, and two other people, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, those three came together and they wrote loads of fake papers. And this is 2017. I can't quite remember. 2017, 2018. Very, very recently. And they threw out these papers that they just completely made up off the top of their head. Zero testing, zero empirical. It can't be considered science. And so it got accepted. Some of these papers started to get accepted by certain publications. And just to elaborate very briefly, because we just touched upon it by quoting the bit of the book, but there was one that was to do with queer performativity in dog parks, which is an odd series of words. So it basically meant they claimed to go up to dog owners. They were like dogs were scrapping with other dogs in the park, and they said, "Excuse me, are you gay?" It's like, okay, so they're making a correlation between like a gay owner of a dog that might be more likely to break up a fight between like a male and female dog, whereas the claim that they made up was that straight owners would like sort of encourage that sort of behavior. So they're saying, I don't know what I could say a particular word, but unwanted advances, shall we say, of a sexual nature were accused of these dogs. So that dog is doing that word. I won't say the R word, but it's doing that to that other dog. And they're saying straight owners are encouraging it, gay owners would break up the act.
Mm.
And their conclusion to this paper was saying, in order to correct that behavior in humans, we need to put straight people on leashes like dogs. And there was another paper that had something to do with butt plugs and sex toys, and that you can see where these sorts of papers are going, right? There was another one that we just mentioned, writing Mein Kampf from a feminist perspective. It's like it was writing, it was just taking quotes from Mein Kampf and just saying, we must rise up against the tyranny of the, and then instead of Jew, it says white man.
Mm.
And people were like, this is excellent, this is fantastic. And they just made it all up. And it was trying to expose how people had these biases. And this isn't widespread. This isn't everywhere, I'm sure. But when we come to certain ideas, and I'm trying to segregate, like, again, critical social justice from social justice. The critical social justice has some certain bad ideas in it, which don't logically add up, or fallacious, or biases, or whatever it may be, that I partly point out in the book. And I'm questioning that. Peter Boghossian questioning that. That's what the studies were trying to do. But they weren't negating the conclusion of social justice. So that's a really important point. There's no, the whole mindset always is. I wasn't sure what that conversation references, but yeah. So to conclude, I thoroughly recommend looking into the grievance studies, at least very briefly going down that rabbit hole, go onto Mikenana's channel, because I'm making the claim that says certain words or certain phrases have now got into sort of atheist discussions and have been normalized, and they are fallacious and they contain biases, and I want to go after like the fallacy and the bias. But the problem is it makes it look like I'm going after social justice, and because there's double meanings involved. So if I were to say, and I know you want to stay away from the race stuff.
If you want to go into it, that's fine. Like I said, I was only trying to skirt that because it just felt like that was outside of my expertise, because I just have not read enough about critical race theory for me to make an intelligent comment on it.
I don't think many of the scholars have read much about what they're writing either. But maybe I'm grandstanding there. But what I will say is critical race theory is like it's a very broad term, and it has ultimately really good intentions because it's trying to solve racism. Like, we don't want racism, we want to solve racism. And some of the conclusions that it comes to, I don't think will achieve the equality that we want. So when it comes to like an idea that's come through, there's different stages and different sort of like a whole spectrum of ideas, and it's going after the fringe. Was what I'm really doing, is by saying some people very sensibly might say in the wake of George Floyd, just do more checks on police. Great. Yeah, keep them in check. Regular education, that might even so much as require more funding, or maybe shifting funding from the amount of weapons and heavy military weapons that they have, and shifting all that funding into education for the police officers. Sounds very reasonable, probably would practically do a lot of good. And then there's other people on the sort of the fringes that say, no, abolish, cannot be reformed. Let's just get rid of the police. And I can't remember, it's Tennessee, Minnesota. Reading something today. There's like a trial that's going on for replacing their police force with something that's more sort of more to do with rehab. So typically, I don't necessarily negate that conclusion at all. I think that's actually quite good in that we're being more sympathetic towards people who potentially can be reformed, but they're just being thrown in prison, throw away the key, and that's not helping them at all. And as we know, if anyone's talked to a grumpy old dude, the only reason he was the only reason he became a neo-Nazi white nationalist is because he went to prison. And that segregated white people here, black people there, Mexicans over there, and that led to infested a culture which meant everybody hated each other. And he eventually left, and he's now a very progressive member of the community. There are some issues in terms of he's still sending threats to people and that sort of thing. And I've said that's, I wouldn't support that, but I mostly agree with like where he's coming from. So when it comes to ideas like abolishing the police, it can be interpreted two ways, or at least two ways. One, if we get rid of them, what do we replace them with? How do we round up murderers, all of that, all the criminals? And if we say something along the lines of community policing, does that necessarily uphold the modernist value of innocence until proven guilty? Do we believe?
I'm not really familiar with anyone that is saying abolish the police. If they are out there, they're very fringe and they're very small segment. The defund the police movement isn't about abolishing the police. It's about breaking the police up into different groups so that they can be more specialized. And particularly, like right now, one of the responsibilities of the police is to respond to calls of people with a mental illness crisis. And really, police training isn't intended to make you a mental health counselor. And so when they say defund the police, what they want them to do is let the police do what they do best, but let's take some of the money that we're putting into the police department for them to respond to mental health crisis and hire mental health counselors, that's their job, is to respond to a mental health crisis. So defund the police isn't about abolishing the police. It's about dividing the responsibilities into more specialized areas.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I wouldn't. It's very important to also be saying, be very clear in our language. I agree in terms of like the defund group are separate from the abolish, and that needs to be made clear. I'm not necessarily, because I don't really know enough about the defund. I think that's has a negative
That's a large
connotation
movement
to it.
Yeah, that's a much larger movement. And
so,
unfortunately, I think they did a bad choice at choosing a name, because too many people hear defund the police and they think abolish the police, and that wasn't what they intended at all.
Yeah. So in terms of this is also the problem. So certain words that are being used, as I'm sure we're just about to get into, certain words that are being used in a particular context can be misinterpreted if you go against it and say something like, I disagree with the phrase defund the police, like we just agreed on. It sounds like we're saying like the complete extreme opposite, and we're saying actually it's fine, the police doesn't need reforming, and that's not our position, so I mean that would come under hasty generalization for the other person, and that is everywhere within theism, atheism, everyone on social media's got a lot to answer for. So yeah, I don't want to go into sort of that too much.
I was kind of wanting to move on as well, because this is a topic we could talk about all day, but there's several other things that I did want to get to as well. And one thing that struck me as very personally was your statement that in the prologue you make the statement, the calls to recognize sex as real can provoke a visceral response from trans activists who believe you are invalidating their existence despite it being true for the entire animal kingdom. And I am a trans activist, so that's why this one came to me.
Well, same, but yeah, carry on.
Yeah. And so my question was, first, are you trying to say that in the animal kingdom, one cannot change one's sex?
That is obviously not what I was saying. No, I realize I've badly worded this bit. It's not that I'm saying that at all. So what I meant to say was that the actual words themselves, male and female, should not be conflated with gender, like man and woman. So so when we say male and female, those are words that pertain to the entire animal kingdom. Like they have different meanings, as I sent you an example of. I think it's the bird that has one type of egg but 3 types of sperm, and then there's a conversation about, does that mean there's 3 types of male, or is it one male that has 3 sperms? And that's not my area. I'm not a biologist. I'm never going to determine that. But that was the first point. I have badly worded that. This point may not necessarily make the book, because I think it deserves this longer conversation, and I've skimmed over it a little bit, and I'm not trying to hide anything. Like it's just I've condensed it down too much. I've essentially come under essentializing, which is also another fallacy. Again, self-correcting myself. So to elaborate, you were right in your response to say we shouldn't conflate sex and gender. I absolutely agree. They're 2 different things, because we can use a very simple example for those who are new to the conversation. So we can say there is a male fox, but we can't say there is a man fox. And so if we refer to the male fox, even though they're called vixens if they're female, but fox is a broader term. If they're male, they produce this, what is determined by biologists and biologists have explained this to me. I could be wrong, because there's multiple ways you can define sex. But typically when we look at animals, we go, they produce the smaller gamete of their species, which is assumed to be the sperm. This gets complicated. I'd love to be able to elaborate on this for a moment. But the larger gamete is typically the ova, the egg, that we refer to as the female produces that. And that's what I'm saying is for the entire animal kingdom. We don't just say the larger gamete for a whale is male, like that. It's still the female because it's the larger gamete. That's the way Lizzie Lang, who's a microbiologist and biochemist, explained it to me with a 3-hour podcast that's on my channel about the science of transgender, with lots of scientific papers up on the screen explaining what we don't know, what we do know. Is genuinely a very good conversation from my perspective. So when I say the phrasing isn't very good of that particular point I've made. So when I say that like the sex is real stuff, it's certain people within trans circles that have conflated those words. Not everyone. Okay. Most people are fine. So there's a good example of this is that if you go to Google and I think I get this in the right order. If you Google the term non-binary, the first thing that comes up is Stonewall's explanation. Actually, I'll get them up if I could. And that refers to men and women, which are gendered terms. Sorry, if you type in, if you can hear the mic, one second, hold on. There we go. So if you type in what is non-binary, if I can spell that right, it'll come up with something that says genderqueer, and Wikipedia will explain it using sex words. So this is, as far as I'm concerned, Wikipedia should be correct in the word. So non-binary or genderqueer is an umbrella term for gender identities that are neither male nor female. Read that again. Gender identities that are male or female, and that male and female are sex words rather than gender words. So there's a degree of conflation going on, and I want clarity. I don't want to get in the way. It's not really any of my business how people live their lives. People have the libertarian free will to do whatever they want with their bodies. None of my business, not in the slightest. But what I do want is from a modernist perspective, clarity. And so we can point at something and say that's that, basically. And I don't really care if there's lots of genders or not. It genuinely doesn't bother me at all. It's a little bit of effort on my path to learn these sorts of things. But there are some ideas that I'm currently having that I haven't thrown out there yet. And I want feedback on this. Polite feedback.
Actually, what you're saying makes complete sense to me because of some things that I have seen on Twitter. I've not gotten involved in some of the arguments where I have seen some theists saying that people who are trans rights activists are themselves confusing gender and sex, while at the same time trying to say that these two things are not the same. And I have not always gotten completely clear on where they feel that the trans activists are confusing the terms. But as you point this out, I think you are right that there are times when even people who are trans activists who are trying to separate these two terms do end up confusing these two terms. Mark Caesar has asked me to bring up a point which I was well aware of. He wants the male seahorse gets pregnant and gives birth to the young.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So typically, older individuals, not necessarily yourself. I'm sorry to bring that up. I'm sorry. But they will view that like the pregnant one is female, and that's obviously patently wrong because it just depends on the gamete itself.
Species, right?
And there are certain species where the smaller gamete producer, the one who has the, and the specific wording is the potential to produce, because you don't always produce throughout your whole life. So if you have the potential to produce based on primary and secondary sex characteristics, that typically denotes that you're male, and it doesn't necessarily bear any reference to who actually has the baby and carries to term. Is the words I'm looking for. I find. Can I throw an idea out there?
Sure, go ahead.
Just quickly, because I think we could, and this is really awkward because I myself am now succumbing to the identity fallacy. I'm like self-censoring myself because I'm saying I'm a straight white male. Why am I talking about this? But I think we could repurpose the term non-binary. Now that isn't trying to negate anyone's identity or anything like that. It doesn't really bother me. But I think from the modernist perspective, the modernist in me wants to have a physical grounding in this sort of thing. And the way that non-binary is explained to me is a bit like, and I'll throw out this sentence, which will need elaborating on, so I apologize. But logically, non-binary as a gender sounds an awful lot like saying atheism is a religion. So allow me to elaborate. We structure the argument by saying religion's over there somewhere. I'm not that. That's how we typically define atheism, roughly speaking, it's right. And we don't therefore come to the conclusion that atheism is a religion. It's a lack of it. Multiple ways we could word that. Non-binary is saying genders are over there, however many we decide there are. I'm not that.
I'm not sure about that. Because and maybe I'm wrong. I'm not non-binary, and although I know some people who are non-binary, I've never discussed it sufficiently that I've gotten all that great a grasp on it. But my understanding of non-binary is I am all of that. I am both male and female. I'm all of that. And I might express myself more male one day, and I might express myself more female one day. Although that gets very close to being gender fluid.
Yeah. Could I just be pedantic as well? Because
sure,
you just said
ahead.
male and female. You just said, and it's fine. You said male and female, but those are sex words, and we're talking gender.
I realize that, but I don't have
we're messing up. Like it's okay.
Right. We need some gender words, I think, is our problem.
Yeah.
And I think that is why we are confusing the conversation, is because we don't have any gender words that are separate from the sex words.
So, yeah, I mean, in that case, I'm perfectly fine with if we intend to say male, say man, that's fine. It could depending on the context, include trans men. These things don't need to necessarily have a absolute set definition, although these terms are sometimes umbrella terms. And that's okay, because atheism is sort of used colloquially and as not like a specific thing, like not theism, as opposed to, it doesn't necessarily include adeism and igtheism and apatheism, but the broader umbrella of atheism contains all those definitions. So we can have multiple meanings. That's fine. But yeah, it's just an idea that's currently sat there, and I genuinely just want genuine feedback from people, because I'm just bouncing these ideas off. And I think the most important thing I want to do is try and create an environment where we can express those ideas and we don't fear repercussions for expressing those ideas. But that can be misinterpreted, because I could be saying, hey, I'm somebody could come along and say, you're negating somebody's gender. You're saying their gender doesn't exist, but you're attacking their personal identity. And that's, as I've just clarified, is not the case at all. So sometimes people might take certain things the wrong way, and maybe that's on me, maybe that's on them. I don't know if that answers some of those further questions that we had. There was a list of some of them.
It does, and Neil is right. I think what we need to do is just let them define themselves as they them, and not try to figure out where they fit on the spectrum of male female, like I was doing. I think that is the mistake that I was making.
Could I throw another idea out there? Because Neil brings up a great point. Everyone sub to Neil. That's compulsory. Whenever Neil turns up in a live chat, everyone sub to Neil. What was the word in his exact comment? I haven't got the live stream up.
I'll
throw that one up again.
Okay. Yeah. How about we let people define themselves as they, and we'll be fine with it.
Yeah. So this is in reference to self-identification, which mostly I'm all right with, because other people know how they feel. Like, how do I know? Like, I'm no authority on somebody else's feelings. But I think there might be a contradiction and potential cognitive dissonance. But when it comes to one specific example, again, tell me I'm wrong, because I haven't had this sort of challenged yet. So there's two ideas that we're trying to uphold together, which we've just mentioned, which is, on one hand, do not conflate sex and gender. And on the other hand, we're saying allow self-identification, and there could potentially be no limits to that. Now, does that mean in certain instances that I've seen on Twitter, and again, not personally afflicted by it, this isn't going to affect my life, but some people are self-identifying their gender as male. Now, do I allow them to do that because they have the free will and self-identity to do so? Or do I say, actually, we shouldn't conflate the two? And that could be interpreted as invalidating that person's self-identity, which is transphobic. So I'm stuck in the middle, and I'm like, well, what do I do?
Yeah, I think we're at a point where we need some more words.
Yeah, probably.
We just simply need some more words. And I think that the use of the they them identification for non-binary people is the beginning.
It's quite useful. Yeah.
Unfortunately, some people have gone to so many different choices that it's impossible to keep up with all of them.
See, this is my my point that I probably failed to make on various different tweets, as some people will be aware of. I do briefly mention the amount of vitriol that comes my way. Jim's brilliant. As long as people feel good, that's like an admirable aim. I'm not necessarily against that. But in terms of sorry, where was I? Jim's to put me off. Damn it, Jim.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's a very elaborate conversation. Maybe it'll come back to me. I was going to say something about. Now it's lost. So what were we talking about just before?
We were talking about choosing your own labels, self-identity. Using
neopronouns. Sorry, someone to interrupt. So yeah, the term neopronouns is something that I've recently used. I knew what they were. I just didn't have a word for them. As we said, we need more words. So a neopronoun is something that isn't necessarily he, she, it, them, whereby we would say he for men, she for women, it for objects, they for possibly plural. Individuals or strangers, plurals, people we don't know, like that sort of thing. And then there's other ones like sie and zir, which are potentially, I think, I can't quite work this one out because I've asked people and they haven't come back to me with anything. They've got back to me, but they haven't explained it. Whereby I think it's a degree of anonymity, like writing MX rather than miss, and that sort of thing. So that's could be potentially useful in some cases if you want to stay anonymous. But then there's other ones which I think do either go too far, or they don't. They're either the same, very similar to one another, or they are questionable. And the problem is that I looked through the 72 genders thing. There's obvious and clear mockery, which doesn't help the situation on some of the images on Google, but there are some that I question. If I could find, again, my aim
you
is
go
not
ahead
to
and look that
invalidate
up,
the
because I've got a
person here.
super chat to bring up.
Go
We have
for
a super chat from Godless Scummer who says, Twitter, that wonderful platform where nuance is king. Cancel Dave. And there was also
We love
another
Jeff.
comment from Atheist Edge that I really wanted to bring up, which was, if making Dave lose his train of thought brightens my day a little, I will absolutely throw Dave off his train of thought.
Yeah, again, this is a really good point that I'll bring up. Worley's reminded me of something, which is that my aim as a man, I don't like to speak in terms of the immutable characteristics that I didn't choose, like if I'm straight, male, man, whatever. But in terms of trying to be supportive and trying to be an ally, I want to support women and trans people. And there are certain arguments where I'm screwed, because before I've even said a word. Take the bathroom example. If we had just individual cubicles for everyone, problem solved. Most expensive option, but problem solved. As such, it's probably not going to practically happen because it's too expensive. So we then have a group of females that are arguing, and they're referred to possibly poisoning the well. This is also in the book, but they're referred to as TERFs, for arguing for female-only spaces, which I would have initially said, yeah, sure, I want to support, what women want or females want, but then there's also trans people that want to claim access to that space, and I want to include both groups, and I can't, because I have to. That's it feels like I have to side on one side or the other, and I don't want to, because I don't want to be a misogynist, and I don't want to be a transphobe, and I want a solution to this.
Well, I think the solution is you have female only spaces, but who identifies as a female is totally up to the person. So if you are a trans female, you are absolutely welcome in a female space. And if you identify as a trans man, then you don't go into a female only space. I think it comes entirely up to how you identify. And I think the issue with that is that the TERFs want to claim that trans women are not women. And that's the whole issue, is that they refuse to accept the existence of people who identify as women.
Yeah, so I'm not here to defend them. I'm not going to be again coming to apophasis mid-sentence. I note the conflation that you've made between saying female spaces and women's spaces. So if if they're self-identifying as a
woman,
I don't really mind that. That's fine. If somebody is identifying as a female, then that's empirically verifiable if they've had surgery, for instance. So again, we're not trying to conflate sex and gender. This is a minefield. I don't want people picking up on every single word that I missay, and I'm not going to try and pick up on your words either. I find that I have to go against somebody, And most people at the minute, and it might be that you're right, because I generally don't know which side to go on. I'm still in a I don't know sort of agnostic position, because 99% of people are saying one thing and 1% are saying the other, and you quite possibly are right in supporting the 1%, and I just don't know yet. I don't know enough. I would like to, if I were dictator, then I would probably just try and go for individual cubicles all over the world, and it's the most expensive option, and it would probably ruin me
the
politically.
other option though is just gender neutral bathrooms.
Yeah. So that's
Gender
exactly what I
neutral
mean.
spaces. Mm-hmm.
So there's two potential ways of getting around that. I know. Do I know it? I mean, I think there's going to be, for better or for worse, opposition to that, because you're mixing everybody together. And I mean, I'm not going to go crazy if I see something that I normally wouldn't see. But I think typically when it comes to, I could be wrong, but typically I think people always prefer and err on the side of their privacy.
Mm-hmm.
Especially conservatives. And yeah, I don't know. I know certain options are more realistic in that they're cheaper, for example. But then there's more expensive options that might actually suit us better. And again, it's going back to the book, because this whole conversation, this cannot be put down into one word like I have, so it won't make the book probably. But when it comes to the conflation of sex and gender, basically I see that happening, and that is like a hypocrisy that I see from certain trans activists,
and
it's
I would
difficult
agree.
not to point that out.
Yeah, and I know that I am guilty of it
because
myself, and yeah, I made the mistake a couple times myself, and I even have my son, when I write a script that's a trans activist script, I usually have my son go over it for me to help me make sure that I haven't made conflations like that, because I do make that mistake myself.
And it's another thing, sorry, is that it's completely forgivable if we get our words wrong. If we get our actions wrong, that's something very different. But even then, to an extent, it's forgivable. And it really, I mean, I got accused of various different things before, and it's like tone policing and various other things. And all I'm trying to do is just trying to work this out for myself. Like, as I said, it typically won't affect my life. And I want as much truth as possible, and obviously value as much happiness and joy in the world as possible. But I also don't want contradictions in terms, because that can lead to certain issues down the line that are much better explained by other people, like the grievance studies hoax stuff, and like where this is leading to, because that's not what the book's sort of implying. All I'm doing is just,
Oops.
Here's the problem kind of thing. Hey, Purple.
I was trying to grab one comment, and this wasn't the one I was trying to grab, because I hadn't even read this. So they just popped up too fast. But this is the
That's
one
a good
that
point
I wanted.
as well.
This is the one that I was trying to grab. Was it's important for us to make amends and learn from our errors.
Yeah. So the main theme of the book, the second book, even if I've royally messed up, is our main objective is to try and create spaces as a community where that can happen. And I don't think we are. I think we're doing the complete opposite. I think we're alienating people. I think we're pushing theists away from atheism. I think we're pushing perfectly normal, reasonable people that have genuine inquiry, like they're questioning certain aspects of, what is non-binary, and they go to the Google, as I just said, and there's two different definitions, and one denotes sex, one denotes gender, and that confuses things, and they say something wrong on Twitter and they get the mob after them. And it's it doesn't need to be that way. And I really value having face-to-face conversations for that reason, because you can pick up on expressions of tone and body language and volume and things like that. I think that's one of the main problems with when I had my Twitter account before, is that my face looked really angry. So people were reading it in an angry tone, Thanks, Jeff. I hope it makes sense.
And I would agree with Jeff 100%, because even reading the book myself, there were a couple of things that I was going, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? But then when we talk face to face
by reading it
and we clarify it, it makes so much more sense. There was one last point I wanted to get to.
I'm going to push to the audio book. Because the people are going to read the book, and you're going to be able to tell the difference between who's read it and who's listened to it.
One last point I wanted to get to, and it goes to what you just said a moment ago about being charitable and accepting of really listening to the other side. You mentioned that we atheists are sometimes alienating the theist community, and I think you're absolutely right, because I personally have trouble getting theists to come on my channel. And I do know that sometimes I am a bit rough on, well, I should say more than a bit. Sometimes I'm really rough on them. And maybe I need to, dial it back a bit. But I also see the exact same thing in the other direction. And I saw Sean McDowell responding to something like that. He mentioned a conversation he had with a young woman that just really threw him, because she said she waited until everyone was gone to ask him, and she asked a question of him that showed some doubt about her faith. And he said, well, why were you so embarrassed to ask this question? And she said, well, because if anyone knew that I was doubting my faith, they all, I don't even know how to explain it now, but people come at you with this, like, why are you questioning? Why are you doing this? Why are you saying this? And it was she didn't want anyone to even know that she was thinking along these lines. And Sean realized, here we have in the theist community created a atmosphere where people can't even question what is it that we believe, because they're so afraid of saying the wrong thing and coming off as a doubter or a skeptic or an atheist, that we can't even ask the questions. So it's interesting that you observe that we're doing the same thing in the atheist community. We're making it so people have a hard time questioning for understanding. We interpret the questions as attacks rather than as questions.
Yeah, and given my return to Twitter, I have tried to just throw out questions more. I know that can and has been misinterpreted before, but in terms of the specific person you mentioned, I hadn't actually heard of. More homework for me, but in terms of attaching these stigmas, I mentioned this in the first book, Fantastic Fallacies and Where to Find Them. Absolutely, asking questions is frowned upon in some cases, and that's why I mentioned this is why we have to create a questioning environment, even if it disagrees with us. As I said at the very beginning, Peter Boghossian would, before he left his job, take flat earthers or various different people on the fringes and bring them into the university and have students question them and have the cogs going and try to engage in critical thinking, because if we engage in that, our own sort of debate skills get better, obviously, but we start to notice flaws in our own arguments. And sometimes it's not, again, the conclusion might be right, but our reasoning is bad. And I hope this book at least goes some way to highlight certain things. One, that we are just as flawed as people we are criticizing. Possibly not as much as flat earthers, but there we are. 2, I want people to recognize that certain language that we're currently using it comes from a flawed place, such as when I mentioned the grievance studies. I think it's very important for people to go and research that, because it's, even if you disagree with it, it's something that is just so shocking. When we try and look at these sorts of behaviors that have come in over the past few years under even pre-Trump and pre-Brexit, but we're just at each other's throats, and people just assume the worst of everyone. And one thing I definitely want to, were you leading this into the bait and switch, by the way? Is that the same
Actually,
person?
I was leading us to a conclusion because we are out of time.
Oh.
And so I'm so
sorry.
And actually, I thought what you were saying was really great for a conclusion, because I wanted you to be able to have one final plug for the book. And yeah, if you're wondering, I actually did have several more questions for Dave, but I also realized that I had more questions than we would have time for, just because, it's better to run out of time than to run out of material.
Sure.
So yeah. With that, I would like to go ahead and close, but Dave, I will let you make one last plug for your book, mostly because there are some people in the chat now that were not here at the beginning, and let them know where they can get it, what form it's going to be, and when it'll be out, and the title.
Yep. So Fantastic Fallacies and Brilliant Biases is a follow-up to the original book from last year, Fantastic Fallacies and Where to Find Them. It typically is, I've had feedback that says it's various aspects of it that are controversial, and it's because the first book was questioning other people, and now you're questioning yourself and your own biases. And it's quite difficult to try and word that in a particular way. So there will be a written book version as before, and there will also be the audiobook that's orated by myself. Both available on Amazon, probably, hopefully in time for Christmas, so that if I'm going to get to that bit in a minute. We do, yes, Marvelous Purple. I can't remember if you were one of the people that interviewed me before. Anyway, the final point I wanted to make was that this basically the next month of just October, before I finalize everything, because it can be quite a, if I mess up the audiobook, it can then sort of delay quite significantly by an extra 15 days or whatever. So I want this next month, over the course of October, just to talk to as many people as possible, get as much feedback as possible, edit it, tweak it, have this wonderful conversation in that I'm pointing out these, I'm getting these very specific lines pointed out to me, because if it's not clear to you, I've messed up, and that's on me, and I want to be as clear as possible. So I need that feedback, because I'm just, these ideas are just circling in my head right now, and I could be profoundly wrong. So I want these interviews. I know at least 3 people that wanted to have a look over the manuscript. 2 of them have definitely got YouTube channels that wanted to do interviews like this, which can be done, typically UK time. I can't really stay up beyond midnight here now like I used to. And to answer Jeff's question, I'm considering bringing back the podcast, but it needs to be done in the right way. And some of these conversations might go off into, because I've always considered talking to theists more and having this outreach more, and demonstrating how to have these conversations with people, especially if nobody's being healthy in the conversation. But it might also go into more controversial topics as well, or I could just not be asked. So yeah, we'll see.
Okay, and with that, coming up on Godless Gray, there will be a show on Wednesday at 7, but I don't have it together yet. It's probably going to be bring your own topic. I'm going to see who's wanting to come, and we'll just talk about whatever anybody wants to talk about, because my better planned show is for the following week. And so I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you especially to Jeff for the super chat. And thank you to David for telling us a little bit about your new book. And with that, everyone, live your life.
Take care.